Okay. Welcome to Good Vibes Solutions. My name is Aleakwe, and my special guest today is Nick DEARDEN from Global Justice Now. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
In this video, Nick is going to give his wealth of experience and tell you about Global Justice Now shortly, but we're going to be talking about people power. Does this exist? Do we, you and I, have the power to change injustices locally, nationally, globally? And also, Nick will be giving insights into trade, food, aid, migration, and the pharmaceutical industry, and more. So please, we welcome your experiences, comments below, share this video, give us insights into what's not in the mainstream. Hello, Nick.
Hello.
Thank you so much for doing this.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Can you please tell the viewers about what you do and Global Justice Now?
We're a campaign organisation, and what that basically means is we mobilise people in order to change stuff. And there's an awful lot of stuff that needs changing in the world. I mean, we live in a world which is completely dominated by the super rich, by big corporations, by elites that have monopolised the world's resources that we all need to live good, dignified lives, and use them to derive as much profit as they possibly can. And we live in a world of runaway inequality. The amount of inequality that currently exists in the world is not normal. It's historically unprecedented. You know the figures that the 8 richest people in the world have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people. The same amount of wealth is controlled by 8 men in the world. That is a massive problem, because by controlling that wealth, by having the resources that are needed to generate that wealth, they are depriving the rest of us of those resources, and they gain that wealth through exploitation of the planet and of our labour. And so what we're calling for is a more equal world. Now that is massive. That's on a huge global scale. But what we tend to do is look at the way that inequality has been driven, and how we can change policies, institutions that are driving that inequality, that will make it a bit more manageable and concrete for people to get involved in. Because if you just say, get rid of inequality, how on earth do I go about doing that? So what we try and do is make it manageable and say, just look what that trade deal is going to do to inequality. Just look at how that food system, that corporation which controls such enormous amounts of the world's food production, look at how that's driving inequality in the world. And we try and change those manageable things. They're still very big. Put pressure on our elected representatives, on politicians, to begin building a different sort of society that works in a different way, it works in a more democratic and equal way. We can begin to grow the seedlings of a new society that will be more equal, more fair, and which won't drive runaway climate change in the way that our current economic system is effectively risking our survival on this planet as a species because of runaway climate change, because it depends upon ever more growth, ever more profits being generated for those at the top, and that's eating away the resources that we need to live on, and also emitting so much poison into the air that we're heating up the planet to a point that we're not going to be able to live on it anymore. This is ridiculous. This is a suicide economy, and we've absolutely got to bring it back to being a human economy that works for the majority of people. And so that's what we do. It's a very grand vision, but we try and pull out those manageable things that ordinary people like us can actually do about it, can actually change.
So that leads me to ask as well, there's us, the ordinary superheroes and sheroes, and you're talking about that grand vision. So in your experience, do you, on the whole, in your experience, do you feel that people don't feel connected when they're watching the news and the social media? Do you sense a connection or disconnect to how it's related to them?
Oh, a complete disconnect. The media, and it's got worse over just the time that I've been doing this. Actually, the media has got worse and more biased, and worse at representing the needs and aspirations and real lives of most ordinary people in our own society. Never mind the ordinary people who are living throughout the world, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, whose resources we take so many of, so that we can live in this way. It's just not represented in any way at all. And that's why I think it's so important, projects like this, that get alternative voices out, that give people an alternative way of understanding their reality and understanding their world is so important. Because, of course, people feel completely disconnected from the constant negative news feed that goes on now 24 hours a day. I mean, it's a roll call of just awful stuff that's happening in the world. And I think most people's reaction to that, completely understandably, is just to turn it off, because it makes you feel completely powerless. What on earth can I do about all of this awful stuff going on in the world? Well, maybe occasionally there's a disaster and I can give a little bit of money to a charity that's helping out in that disaster, but fundamentally there's not a lot I can do, so I will focus just on my family or my community, or and not engage with the world. And I really think that suits the interests of those who have profited so much from the current economic system, because they don't want ordinary people to be engaged in trying to change things. That's a real democracy. We're always told we live in a democracy. A real democracy is where ordinary people are engaged day in, day out in having some control over their lives and the lives of the people who live in their community. And we don't have that at the moment. And that's why you see the frustration and the anger that people feel that they've been marginalized for such a long time. There's horrible things going on in the world for sure. The election of Donald Trump in the White House, Brexit and the wave against migrants in the whole of Europe. Scary stuff, scary people coming into power. But in a way, they haven't come out of nowhere. They've come out of people being patronized and talked down to and told they don't matter for a very long period of time. And I think people have had enough of that. And they said, well, to hell with you all. And our job is to say, that's not the only response to what's going on in the world. You don't have to have a kind of nihilistic, let's just burn it all down response. We can actually affect positive change. We can create a better world. It's been done before. We can do it now. And my God, the urgency of creating that means we've got to get involved at this point in history if we want to see that better world realized.
And in terms of, us being kind of authors to our change for sustainable change that's effective for everybody, can you give examples that we might not know about the global justice campaigns and how engagement has changed for the better? Or, give an example of what you guys do.
Well, let's take one example, which is TTIP, which was a very big trade deal that was being negotiated a few years ago between the European Union and the United States. And this trade deal was all about giving corporations more rights and further eroding our democracy. So at the center of TTIP was this thing called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, but we call it a corporate court system. Basically, this allows foreign corporations to sue governments for doing stuff which is normally in our interests or the interest of protecting our environment, but is bad for the corporation because they can't make as much money as they expected to make. And so they sue governments for doing this by saying, well, because we can't now profit in the way we'd hoped to, you're essentially stealing our property. This is complete rubbish. I mean, governments pass regulations all the time, and in the best circumstances, those regulations are aimed at making society a better place. So you look at, for example, in Australia, they tried to put cigarettes in plain packaging to try and put people off smoking because they said it's bad for your health. In Uruguay, they put health warnings on packets, on cigarette packets. They were sued for that by the biggest cigarette manufacturer in the world in one of these corporate court systems. It cost the Australian government tens of millions of dollars, we believe, to fight against this case. Fortunately, they did win in the end. But these cases are happening all over the world all the time. Australia is being sued for putting the minimum wage up of its public sector workers by a corporation, Veolia actually, that works in this country. People will have seen the vans in many parts of this country because they deal with wastewater and sewage and so on. So this was going to create one of these corporate court systems that already exist in loads of treaties, but it was going to create the biggest one, essentially, that's ever been invented, which would have allowed American multinational corporations to sue the British government for doing anything which said multinational doesn't like, essentially. It was a massive transfer of power from people to corporations. There's nothing to prevent those corporations taking the same cases in domestic courts like the rest of us have to. But no. We were told they're such delicate things that they actually need a special legal system to enforce their so-called rights. And of course, their right to make money apparently trumps all the rest of our rights to live a decent, dignified life. So we fought against this because we said this treaty is just simply a corporate charter. And at the beginning, no one had heard about TTIP. We went to talk to politicians, didn't know what it was, kind of thought we were making it up, to be honest. Talked to journalists, not interested, no one wanted to cover it. And so we talked to people about this, and we went all around the country doing meetings, and we did alternative media like this, telling people. Gradually, people started learning about it, and people started getting very angry right across Europe. And we launched a formal public petition saying, please don't pass this treaty. And we had to get 1 million signatures in a year. That was our goal. We got 3.5 million signatures from ordinary Europeans in a year. So well exceeded our expectations on a really, and TTIP, it's an acronym in itself. Right? It seems like quite an unfriendly subject for most people to get to grips with. Actually, in their millions, people could immediately see what this would mean for their lives. People here were very worried about the NHS. What if we try and take the NHS back into public ownership? Will foreign corporations sue us for that? Yes, they probably will. So they were worried about that. They were worried about big American agribusiness exporting food made under terrible animal welfare conditions into the European Union and outcompeting farmers here. So all these worries, we really made concrete for people what this treaty would mean. People started approaching their local councillors saying, we don't want this here. Councils started saying, okay, we're a TTIP-free zone. We don't want this treaty. All over Europe. Turns out the negotiators in the end couldn't find a city to negotiate TTIP in that wasn't a TTIP-free zone. So a wonderful grassroots campaign. And last year, we stopped it. We stopped the biggest trade agreement that would ever have been signed from taking place because we didn't believe it was in the interests of most people in the world, of most people in Europe and America, and it was in the interests of big business. And we stopped it happening. And that is one of the greatest moments of my life when we stopped that happening, because it absolutely proved, doesn't matter what politicians think, doesn't matter what journalists think, doesn't matter what big business think, if enough people come together to change something, they can change something. And the fact that we stopped that happening against all the odds really, to me, proves that people power can work. Now, that's a big example, but there are many, many little examples all the time of people fighting for small things in their community, small things in their local area, and winning. And the problem is we don't hear about that as much as we should do in the news. The news is all about, I think, making people feel really disempowered, really like I have no control over any of this. But actually, if you look at what people are doing all the time, they are fighting and winning for small things and for big things. And that's how change comes about for me. Yes, it can take a long time. Yes, it can be difficult and hard work, but ultimately you can win. And throughout history, we have won. And I think we're standing on the shoulders of giants. The people I look back on as my heroes are the people who fought against the slave trade, both the slaves themselves and the campaigners in solidarity with them in this country 200 years ago, when everybody thought that was completely normal. How on earth can you do away with slavery? It's not possible. That's how our economy works. They did. People who were asking for the vote, ordinary working people, women. Apartheid in South Africa. Again, we were told it's never going to end. And it took decades. It took decades of committed campaigning, but that's how change comes about. And I think, we wouldn't be sitting here in this room today, living, reasonably nice lives with most of our needs met, if it wasn't for the people who've gone before us campaigning for that to change. And life must have been really hard, much harder for them than it is for us. They really had a political establishment that was repressive. They really had media saying, who are these troublemakers? You have no role to play in our civilized society. But they did it. They did it.
Congratulations, well done.
It just gives me hope, and I think everybody should feel hope. Everybody should feel the reason that the majority of us today are not toiling away in mines or horrific sweatshops or as landless peasants is because people have fought through the ages, and we've got to keep that up now.
Exactly. The level of spirit continues. So please comment below, share this video. Please share also the kind of grassroots campaign. If you're, community leaders or anything like that, or just one person with a petition and trying to make some positive, sustained change, please share your links and comment below. We'd welcome that. So a couple of things. I always throw in a lyric because there's loads of things that inspire. I used to be obsessed with a band called James. And Tim Booth, yes. And I think it was Tim or one of the guys in the band. One of the tracks, I can't remember, I think it was talking about kind of like poll tax and reaction to Thatcherite years. And one of the lyrics that stayed with me that doesn't seem to change is money is directed to ambition and not to need. And I wondered, with that in mind, when I've read and heard, what is your response when you hear or read someone saying, there's not enough to go around. There's not enough food or resources for everybody. There's no more room. What kind of reaction would you say? You touched on it at the beginning about the monopolization of wealth, but what's your reaction to that?
This is one of the great myths of the society that we live in. There's not enough food, therefore we need more food, so we have to grow it intensively and we have to hand it over to big business because they're the only people that can grow food in that way. It is completely untrue. There is enough food in the world to feed everybody today, yet just under 1 billion people in the world are hungry, don't have enough food, some of them seriously hungry and malnourished. So something's going wrong in the system. It isn't a matter of there are too many people on the planet and we can't grow enough food for them. There is. And anybody tells you we've got to put all of our faith in this technical solution, we don't need the technical solution. There's already enough food. The problem is political. The problem is we have an economic system which essentially sells food where it's most profitable and grows it where it's cheapest. So most of our food is being grown in the developing world, in the global south. Yet it is precisely in those areas that people are growing the food that there is often malnourishment and people go hungry. And why is that? Because the laws of the market have come to prevail in the production and distribution of food around the world, and they are failing. I mean, we're constantly told the market is the most efficient way of doing things. Leave it to business, leave it to the private sector, leave it to the market, everything will come good. Well, it's clearly not true. It's clearly not true because not everybody's being fed. It's clearly not true because although we have the medicines available in the world, we've invented and created the medicines, often with public money, to treat so many conditions, people are still dying and suffering as a result of those conditions because they can't afford the medicine that we've invented. So something's going seriously wrong here. And I like to think back to the Second World War. In this part of the world, after the Second World War, people decided we're not going back, having fought for our country, having fought against fascism, we are not going back to a situation where whether we live or die when we're ill depends on how much money we've got, where the type of education we get depends on how much money we've got, depends upon the market, where whether we get a house or not depends upon the market. Actually, we're taking those things out of the market to one extent or another because they're too important. Our human rights and our human needs are too important to be left to wealth and to the market. And we're going to provide them in a different way. We're going to provide them in a public way, hopefully in a democratic way as well. And gradually over time, those things have been taken away from us again. They've been privatized. They've been enclosed. You talked about the levelers earlier. Really interesting in this country, way back hundreds of years ago, peasants, and most people were peasants, of course, could graze their animals and collect what they needed for their life from common land that they had access to, and that the landlord couldn't stop them going into and grazing their animals, taking their plants, getting wood for fuel and for building their homes. And it was all taken away from them. They called it the enclosures. Landlords literally put up fences, enclosed land, and said, "That's mine. You're not coming on that land anymore. I'm going to use that land to grow for profit." And so it was taken away from them, and that's how people were forced into what William Blake called the satanic mills of Lancashire, labouring their lives away in horrific conditions in the sweatshops of the Industrial Revolution. That's the only way you could force people to do that, take away their livelihoods. Well, I think of things like healthcare and education and so on as like our modern commons, our modern common land that was run for the public, by the public. And wealth didn't come into whether you accessed your human rights, your human needs. And it's been taken away from us by privatization. by liberalisation over the last 30 or 40 years, and we've been told the market is so efficient. It's not true. And the reason so many people are suffering in our society today is that public services have been marketised, privatised, and cut to the bone. And we can see that the effect that that's had in our own society, the amount of poverty now that's accumulating just in our own society, while some people are more wealthy than they've ever been before. It can't be right. It's driving inequality in our world. The market, sure, I'm not saying the market has no role to play in our society. The market can provide certain things. But when it comes to things we absolutely need and depend upon to have a decent life, a dignified life, it shouldn't depend upon how much money we've got. It shouldn't depend upon the rules of the market. And we've got to change this. And we can change this through trade rules. We can change this through industrial strategy, government policy. We've done it before, and we can do it again. And it's absolutely critical we do it now, because inequality has got to a completely unsustainable point. So we must. And I really like what you said at the beginning, talking about James and so on, because I have been so inspired by music, by films, by art over the world. You know, it's over my lifetime. That's what's brought me to this stage. It's not just people who talk politics on the street. It's culture. Yes. It's art. It's because I think in those spheres you have the ability to easily convey what politicians find so hard to convey, which is the world could be like this. Yes. And it should be. Yeah. And there's no reason it can't. It just needs enough of us to say that. And it seems unrealistic. But the world has changed so much in the last 100 years, just so much. And if it can change as much as if attitudes towards women's equality changed as much as it has in the last 100 years, attitudes towards sexuality has changed so much just in the last 20 years. Right? These attitudes and behaviours have changed. And if they can change with relation to those things, they can change with relation to how we manage the economy.
Exactly. I think the fundamental points that Nick is making, just another thing I want to add as well is what you just touched on in terms of language. What's it called? They're smart. I think there's people also might feel intimidated by whether it's intentional or not, the kind of academic or oblique languages and vocabulary that is used, that they're thinking, oh, okay, we'll leave it to them. Right. You have elected officials who should be representing your interests and theirs, not just their pockets. Now, we have met, I have interviewed, and the different networks I've worked for, there are amazing people with the same convictions that we and you have. They are politicians. It's very, very difficult mountains and daily struggles, and they do actually represent their constituents. You know, there are other Tony Benns and male and females in the peers, in everything, MEPs and stuff. So the thing is about it, I think the language needs to be changed as well. Or please get involved with global justice now, because at least this is insights. There's so much else that's going on, but it's accessible. But there are others. We're not dismissing the hard work that people in establishment do, local government, federal government, MEPs, and all these things. It's just that the language, look beyond that or ask. If you don't know, ask. That's all I'm. That's why I've been trying to get this busy man for about 1.5 years to talk on this, because he can articulate it better. And a lot of things are done in sound bites and stuff. And I've given it this platform because he can explain these different things. But it's in your power to get involved with Global Justice Now and other platforms and campaigning organizations. Now, leading into something else I wanted to talk about very quickly is root causes. There's so many things that are tackled. I mean, it depends where you're looking. Alternative media, mainstream media, but it's all sound bites, all touching on stuff. And it's the same vicious cycle of life. And it's not news. It's like, yeah, we've heard this before. What's changed? So maybe if it's not history repeating itself, it's the lack of action. Things happen recurring all the time. So I want to ask you, is it that I find that people are more ready to accept the lies that they are told, not realizing their lies by media, by government and stuff. And there's so much blame on the wrong people, refugees, asylum seekers, poor people. racism, all of these things. I get it. People are under so much pressure. It's either implosion or attack. But why don't they hold their elected officials to account? Why do you think lies are so easily believed?
I think people, to a large degree, gave up on their elected officials, gave up on the institutions that were supposed to provide them with a voice in society for very understandable reasons. I mean, we remember very well, and I'm sure many of the viewers will, the Iraq War. And at that time, when so many of us, when virtually the whole country was saying, please don't do this. We don't believe in this, and we don't want you to spend our resources destroying a country. There are other ways to bring about peace and good leadership in the world. And we were ignored, weren't we? We were completely ignored despite everything, despite the biggest march in history in this country. And I think people said, well, you're just not listening to us. You just don't care what we say. And I think as a result of that, things have changed, actually. Things have actually changed a lot in politics. But I think out there, it's still the case that for an enormous amount of people, they don't trust politicians and they don't believe what they say. And therefore, I think they've stopped trying to hold them to account because they think that they just don't care and they can't, and there's nothing they can do to change their minds. That isn't true. There are definitely occasions when it is very, very difficult to make your point, when what you're asking for seems really enormous, and how is anyone going to listen to me? But I have seen people change their minds in those positions. But I also think it's right, people are right, that you can't just leave it to elected officials to change things. Look, any big change, any seriously progressive change, any massive leap forward in the way we live has always come from ordinary people organising themselves in their workplace, in their places of study, in their places of worship, on the streets. That's how all really big change has come. And you look back now to some of the inspiring movements. I was watching a film the other day about the life of Martin Luther King. They were under such immense pressure. Nobody in the establishment at the beginning took them seriously. And they faced actually life-threatening violence on the streets to fight apartheid in the United States, parts of the United States. So change has always come from us organising, and politicians will never listen to us if we don't organise. There is a degree of truth. Of course, a lot of politicians are very hardworking and do genuinely care and were elected for the right reasons. But by and large, if you don't get that pressure, if you don't feel this is what people are asking you for, this is what people want, this is how people are organising, if you don't make politicians feel I can't do anything other than this, then we're also not doing our jobs. It's not just them not doing their jobs. We're not doing our jobs either. I understand why, after decades where it just seemed like things were getting worse and worse and worse and there was no hope, people kind of gave up. And people were too ready to listen to those in society who spread hate and demonization against people who are actually the victims of modern society. So migrants. Why is there so much migration in the world? Because there is so much war, political conflict and political repression, because of the trade deals that we've done, because of the financial institutions that have completely screwed over people's economies, that have taken their livelihoods away from them. People want a better life. We all want a better life. So people are moving for completely inexplicable reasons. And 9 times out of 10, Western governments like our own have made those people's lives intolerable.
Overt and covert destabilization.
Yes,
it's out there. It's not being made up. Read up.
So they're not the problem. Migrants are not the problem. They're moving for completely legitimate reasons. Yet it's easy, and I think there's maybe even something in where we've come from biologically. And whip people up into a frenzy when they're struggling in their own lives, they're struggling to make ends meet. It's too easy to fall into that trap. Sometimes you do despair. I mean, sometimes you look at a multi-millionaire idiot sitting in the White House, whipping people up against migrants who are moving because his government over the years has made those people's lives intolerable in the countries they're living in, and they're coming to America to get back a bit of the wealth that's been stolen from them by his class and his corporations and the actions of his governments, and then they're treated like they're the problem, like they've created this mess. They haven't. But I think, you know, it is sometimes understandable why people who are struggling and don't have time to keep up with issues in the way that maybe they should, who don't understand because the news doesn't explain it to them properly, they think, well, okay, our country's just full. It must be full because it's not giving me a decent livelihood. It's not giving me a decent life. So we just don't, whatever I think, we don't have the room for these people. We don't have the resources for these people. Of course, it's completely untrue, because actually the reason that the migrants are in the situation they're in is often very, very similar to the reason you're in the situation you're in. It's that the resources that we all need to live a better life have been monopolized by those at the top. And those at the top are manipulating you, are twisting the situation to make it look like it's those people's problem. There's a wonderful old cartoon that I saw once, and it's from 100 years ago or so. And it's got a picture of the big boss who controls the company and is super rich and so on. And it's got a number of workers around a table, and the boss is whispering to one of the workers, you better watch out for that guy. I think he's trying to get your slice of cake. He's trying to get your resources. You know, that's the classic divide and rule tactic, because the boss knows that if we actually joined together and fought back for something better, for a better life for ourselves, he would be the one that would be losing resources, exactly. And we would be the ones living a decent life. So it's a frightening time, but we've got to combat it, both by absolutely combating the likes of Trump on the streets, and we will be doing that when he arrives in London on the 13th of July. We think it's a disgrace that he's been, especially the horrific images that we've been seeing of children separated from their parents and kept in cages over the last week. Just obscene. I mean, almost unbelievable. Disgusting that the red carpet should be rolled out for this man, and we must protest this in the streets. But you know, we've also got to do more than that. We've got to give people hope. We've got to give people a sense that we can create something better, that the future can be better than the past. And that's what politicians have failed to do for a long time now. And if politicians are going to continue failing us, we need to do it ourselves. Yes. That's how changes always come about.
We're coming to the end of this. We welcome your comments. Please like, comment, share this. We welcome your insight and experiences in any of the topics involved. We're coming to the end. Before Nick tells us more about how you can get involved with Global Justice Now and their different, very varied campaigns on pharmaceutical industry, aid, migration, and what's it called? Trade as well, and other very important things you can get involved in. I wanted to ask, so the thing is, this cyclical and seemingly continuous injustices that happen, I wonder, did you have any thoughts on things like the United Nations, the different bodies that exist, International Criminal Court, the ICC, the UN, the Supreme Court? When I look on their pages and their updates, I only ever see non-Western, genocidal, allegedly genocidal ex-leaders being investigated, mainly not being held to account with a jail sentence, or anyone else, different levels and soldiers in that hierarchy. It's always African, possibly Latin American, and no others. Even if it's alleged, I can't see anybody tried outside of that. Possibly also, forgive me, places like what's called former Yugoslavia, Serbia, and things, and other places. Is there any point to that? They do amazing work, by the way. You know, go to their sites and see what they're doing. They're necessary, but I don't see anyone held to actual account. What is their purpose, and are they needed?
So I think a lot of these institutions and organizations were set up with the best of reasons and the best of intentions. That a leader who abuses the human rights of their people to the extent of enslaving them, to the extent of genocide, murdering them, to the extent of imprisoning and torturing them, needs to be held to account. And sometimes it's very difficult for people within a specific country to get the justice that they require against that leader. And as an international community, we should have the responsibility to help them in solidarity get that justice, and help them to put their country and their economy back on track, and develop more democratic ways of doing things and so on. So many people across the world are crying out for that. And I'm an internationalist, so I think, you know, we have a responsibility to help them, because my part of the world has created so many of these problems in other parts of the world in the first place. However, the problem is those institutions then come up against political reality, which says, yeah, it might be all right to do it against this African leader over here, but heaven forbid we actually challenge the office of the US president by putting George W. Bush on trial for the crimes he has committed in the Middle East, or putting former Prime Minister Tony Blair on trial for the crimes that he has committed in the Middle East. We just can't get the political reality says that is not possible. And therefore it doesn't happen. And therefore the only people you end up trying are people who actually, in terms of the damage they've caused, and the damage may be horrific, of course, but actually is more limited than the damage created by some of the real leaders of the world, who have the whole world to play with, and have created just the most horrendous suffering and impoverishment. My solution to that is to say the initial idea there is a good one. How do we apply that to everybody? You see, I don't like the idea that, well, because it's unfair at the moment, we get rid of the whole thing, and say the whole thing must be completely useless, and we go back to a kind of law of the bully, which is basically what Trump wants to do. Why is Trump ripping up these institutions? Because he actually likes the law of the bully. That's the kind of world he wants to live in, where the big man, the biggest man, gets all the say, and that's where things proceed from, and nobody else has any rights, and democracy is eroded and so on. That's what he's doing in America at the moment. You know, he's an incredible showman, isn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he's always on the front of the newspapers,
distraction media,
and it's all distraction, because behind the scenes he is dismantling any kind of institution which can possibly give any kind of justice to people, and cementing
that. That's the problem. Look over here.
Absolutely. So I absolutely share completely the anger and frustration that people have, that somehow it only seems to be Africans who were ever accused of human rights abuses and brought to justice for it. Absolutely share that. But I think the way we go about changing that is to say, no, we want Tony Blair and George Bush taken to task at these institutions for the damage that they've created in the world. The institutions themselves should be genuinely neutral and independent. If they're not, it's for us as people to push to make them so. I mean, let's be honest, we would never have had a United Nations if people after the Second World War had not been so desperate right around the world for ways of cooperating and ways of peaceful coexistence that would not lead once again to plunge the whole world into a deadly conflict. You know, so many lives, so much potential had been unnecessarily lost in the first half of the 20th century, and people said we've got to find a different way of doing things, and ordinary people pushed for that, and I think it's what Trump's doing now is trying to rip up that order. The order's already been ripped up by the enormous power that a few people have in the world today, the enormous power of big business and so on. That's already been massively damaging to these institutions, and now Trump says let's just wipe them away altogether, and I don't think that gets us to a fairer world. The fairer world for me is to say, let's actually look who's really causing the damage that we see all around the world today, whether it's damage to the environment or damage to ordinary people. Let's really see who's causing the damage and make sure they are held to account for their actions. And one day I would very, very much like to see the current president of the United States on international trial for the incredible damage that he's done both to his own society and globally. The rhetoric that he employs makes people feel scared, afraid for their lives, and has created real violence. You can see with the kind of people that he's effectively given the go-ahead to, the fascists and so on in many parts, the white supremacists in many parts of the United States. It's obscene. It's obscene, and we need internationally to have a way of holding those people to account. But we can get there. I mean, none of these institutions would have existed in the first place. The idea for these institutions would never have existed without movements of ordinary people pushing for it. I mean, look at the changes brought about by the French Revolution, or the Russian Revolution. People just said, we've had enough. Society needs to be turned upside down because it's so completely unfair that while some people live in unbelievable luxury, other people are starving. And that was where these institutions started being created. The very notions of democracy that we live with today came from those periods of incredible change. And I think, possibly we are on the verge of another period of such change again. I think we're at a crossroads anyway. There is a very dark path ahead of us if people like us sit around and say it's all too much, it's overwhelming. I like to think back sometimes to the horrors of the 1930s and to think, well, what would I have done in that situation? Maybe I would have been too scared to do anything. But I like to think, and I like to look at the incredible resistance in the most awful circumstances that people put up to what was happening in the 1930s. And without those people doing that, we would not, after the Second World War, have begun to create the fairer world that began to come about at that point. It was far, far from perfect. But certainly a lot of the injustices that people had experienced up to that were wiped away by the post-war settlement. And that's what we've got to do now for another age.
I think what's really key is everything that you've mentioned, but very, very quickly, it's human nature. There's good and bad in all of us. And I realize that people can be, those pressures can, we change every single day. It's simply about the divide and conquer that you mentioned. And I think it's very, very sad. If we removed all this distraction media and this kind of theatre of war, people could actually easily see beyond this kind of so-called quote unquote reality television and social media circus and news nonsense. I think people would actually see better. It's great to have a distraction. Sometimes you need that. You need light-hearted stuff. It's great to semblance. But what scares me the most is the disturbing reality of some things. If you do not see so-called leaders who are actually wolf in something's clothing, that they wolf in sheep's clothing. They're actually dictators and rulers because they're not leading us towards a greater good and a change. So if you remove the distraction, you'd see that people think, okay, they're not being held to account. They're not, they're manipulating our funds. You find money for this, but not for that. Okay, we thought we didn't have any money. So how can you not, well, I can do what I like. That's my, for example, mob justice. When you're seeing a person, I saw a young child who had stolen food from the market and his own people, someone filming it, and he was burned alive for stealing a piece of food from hunger. And I was just, it auto-played. So I stopped that. I didn't want to feed it, give it ratings and stuff, but it disturbed me that it could be filmed. No one did anything. But they knew they wouldn't be held to account or prison because the police people aren't being paid. No one wants to get involved because they'll be turned on. These kind of things. If your leaders aren't held to account, there's lack of funding for actual law and order, or you get away with it. Of course, people are going to do that. But as Nick is saying, another world is totally possible. So please get involved. Nick is going to tell you a very brief overview about the key projects that are keeping him and his team busy and how you can get involved and how you can connect with him on your website, please.
And I think you're at such an important point. Never give up on the power of humanity to do good. Of course, as human beings, we can do the most atrocious, horrific, evil stuff. But you see in everyday life that people can also be incredibly good, altruistic, show incredible solidarity with people, and you must never give up on that. And when we have a world that incentivizes people to be greedy, selfish, and evil, it's no wonder that loads of people end up being like that. We actually need to put rules in place and create societies that incentivize people to be altruistic, to be solidaristic, and to be good, and never give up on the potential for that. History is so full of examples of people making the most incredible sacrifice for a better society, for other people to be able to live better than they were able to live, and it's really moving. I think when you look at some of those examples. How can people get involved? Obviously, go to our website, Global Justice. and you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it too. At the moment, we are desperately trying to change something that's going through Parliament, which would allow our Secretary of State, after Brexit has happened, to negotiate trade deals that could be completely disastrous, not only for people here, but for people around the world. So when we have our Trade Secretary going off to countries like Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, Turkey, talking to people who run really dictatorial regimes who are at war many times with their own people, the last thing we want to be doing is signing a trade deal which will legitimize those dictators in office. So we need to hold the Trade Secretary to account, and that means we need to have democratic control of our trade policy. At the moment, we haven't got it. The Trade Secretary can do more or less whatever he wants. Even our elected representatives can't stop what he's doing. So at the moment, we're running a campaign on that. And then in the future, we're just planning a campaign now, which will be about trying to end the use of these corporate courts I was talking about earlier, that allow foreign multinationals to sue governments when they take action in the public interest. So there's so much action going on around the world on this to try and end the practice of these corporate courts. We think we can really do it. And in 5 to 10 years' time, these things could be history. And we could end up with a more democratic world, a more democratic trade system. So that's what we're working on there. We've also got some other campaigns that you've already mentioned, but certainly on migration, we're organising meetings, we've got materials to try and convince people in this country that migrants are not their problem. The problem that they're experiencing in their lives with joblessness, with poverty, with their resources being taken from them, essentially. It's not migrants that's to blame for that. It's government policies. And so we're actually putting together a campaign which is all about welcoming migrants and saying, this isn't a migrant crisis, it's a crisis created by governments, by politicians, by institutions. And that if you want a fairer society, attacking migrants will not get you there. That will just get you a more unfair society. That will actually blame the victim for some of the problems that you're suffering from as well. But that actually, by taking political action against poverty, against the kind of government policies that are creating poverty in our society, then we will actually be able to create a better society. So that's part of our migration work. And then we are campaigning against big corporations, especially at the moment, big pharmaceutical corporations that are just making an absolute fortune while people are unable to afford the medicines that they produce, despite the fact that very, very often public money, taxpayer money has gone in to develop those medicines. But then that knowledge is handed over to a corporation, they develop a medicine, and we have to pay through the nose for it. In our country, fortunately, the NHS pays, but it's actually creating real problems for the NHS. It's sucking resources out of the NHS that should be used to help treat people. But in other countries around the world, of course, people don't have NHSs. They simply cannot afford medicines that they desperately, desperately need to allow them to live, but certainly to allow them to live without the kind of suffering that they have to go through. It's all completely unnecessary, but change will only come about when we demand it, because otherwise people will go on making a profit if they can make a profit. They will only stop making a profit if we say we will no longer allow you to make that profit anymore. We will no longer tolerate society being organised in this way anymore. So please get involved in whichever of those campaigns interests you. If you want to set up a local group, or you live in an area where we already have a local group, then you can get involved in that, and you can have discussions with people like yourself from your local area who want to do things, who want to use their time to raise awareness of these issues in their own area and change things. And as I say, that's why I'm so happy working for this organisation, because we have a network of local activists and local groups around the country, and they are the people that really change things, not us sitting in an office. We help, but it's you that can really change things.
He's not bigging himself enough. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching. As I say, like, subscribe, share, comment below. We welcome your input and reactions to the topics discussed. Peace out. You have the power.